My name is Ann Dietrich, maiden name King, otherwise known as Beau, B-E-A-U, because French friend said what a beautiful baby and nicknamed him Beau. So he grew up Beau, and his father had gone to the Naval Academy, so he followed him to the Naval Academy. He was tempted otherwise, but his father said no, and graduated wanting to just go to sea in a ship. It was, 51, it'd been 1947. Actually, he thought because his father was a Navy pilot, he thought maybe he'd like to fly. And I know his parents weren't happy about that. They thought they would much rather see, his mother especially, much rather see him on a ship, having worried about his father all those years. So he went to sea in a ship, and they were on plane guard duty, and he watched a couple of pilots go in, and I guess he decided he'd stick with ships. His father was also Henry Thornton Dietrich, and he retired as Navy captain, and he was the class of 1926, I believe, at the Naval Academy. I know he was on a carrier in the Pacific during World War II. My father lived in Nebraska, grew up in Nebraska, and his father died kind of young, and his mother was very educated. She had a college degree early, and she was worried about getting the children educated, and so she found out about the service academies and the local congressman that she knew, and both he and my uncle went to the Naval Academy with presidential appointments from Nebraska. And he went at 15. You can't do that now, but 15. And at 18, he graduated as an ensign and was on a ship, an old four-piper destroyer headed for the Mediterranean. Now, he stayed in the Navy at that time, maybe 3 years, whatever was required, and was part of the escort bringing the unknown soldier from World War I back on Olympia, I believe it was, into Philadelphia. And I gave a photograph of that from the newspaper clipping rather, that I had to the Navy Museum. But he went back in during World War II and never got out of Washington. He wanted to, but he was not young then. My uncle, who was younger, who graduated from the Naval Academy in 1924, ended up in the Pacific. He was damage control officer in Bunker Hill when it was hit by kamikaze planes, and earned the Navy Cross for that time. He's my youngest son could tell you a lot, because he would ask him, and he and Uncle Shane sat and talked a lot about it, but no, he did not with me. I'm not sure I wanted to hear, but Will wanted to hear. I was 10 when we came to Washington in 41, and he was, as I told you, frustrated. He couldn't get out in the fray, but he was doing a very good job where he was, and he was a very bright man. And we had maps of from the National Geographic on the wall, and he moved pins where the forces were, what they were doing. And I was the only one to share it with. My mother wasn't especially interested, but I was. And we went to every war movie he could find. we had a movie theater that was walking distance from the house, and we went to those together. Well, for a little while he worked for the Atomic Energy Commission. My uncle was really unhappy with him because instead of staying in the Naval Reserve, instead of staying in the Navy longer again to retirement, he did not do that, and that was hard financially for them. My parents had very little money, and it was tough. But I was an only child, so I was called Depression Annie, because I was born in 31 in the Depression. And his first job when he left the Navy the first time, I think it was the first one, I know he went to New York, and he worked for Maynard Oakley Lawrence. It was a stockbroker's firm, but he was a statistician, not a stockbroker, a statistician. And so they all, they lose their jobs with the depression, but they took a pay cut. So they decided I was the only one they could afford. So I was Depression Annie. Well, we met in Washington. There were a lot of military juniors around. With World War II, it was a crowded city suddenly from a quiet town. And we just met, and a couple of years later, he didn't have another date and asked me for one. And it just started in his first class year, really, the romance started. And we were not married for a year after that because our parents all felt we should have a couple of paychecks under his belt and be ready to start. So when I met him, he was in a destroyer. That was his first ship, and they went to the Mediterranean. And we weren't married when he reported to that ship, and then we were to be married in September of the following year, and the ship got sudden change in its deployment to go to the Mediterranean early. So the wedding was moved up to August. So our marriage started with a deployment for him of 6 months. After 2 weeks, that wasn't ideal, but that was typically Navy. I thought it was a wonderful looking ship. I don't remember. I remember a friend of mine telling a story when she saw this carrier that her husband-to-be was serving on, that she said, "Oh my, what a big boat." And of course she was laughed to death about that, because you never call a Navy ship a boat. And I remembered that story with the ship. I enjoyed all those ships. I enjoyed all the ships. I was on board all of them, and for meals, and it was very. I loved it. I loved it all. I was taken around to see various spaces. I didn't climb very high or very low, but just enjoyed it. And then he was sent as XO of an LST, and so that took us from Norfolk to the West Coast, and then back to the East Coast to have command of a minesweeper, the Courser. And then, did we come ashore finally? I think, yes, we went to Monterey then, and he became aide to Buddy Yeomans, who was superintendent of the postgraduate school. So we were there 2 years as our first shore duty. And then, with nice reports from an admiral, as a lieutenant, he was XO of a destroyer, Picking. And we lived in Long Beach. I remember that. And while he was XO, they had a collision with an aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. And he said that was one of the scariest nights of his life. He was the executive officer, and he was sleeping where he should have been then, which he should have been doing. And then he said, when the engines stop, that's scary. And they stopped. And so the ship veered into, I used to know the name of the carrier, I probably should have written all this down, but into the ship, and it crushed their bow back. And they were taking on a lot of water, and Bo was down in the spaces a lot during that. And it was kind of a scary time. But they got to the Philippines, underway very slowly, and were repaired out there. But at home, it was awful hearing the things about it until we knew they were all safe. Nobody was injured, and that was a blessing. Well, it wasn't always easy, but it was fine. It was very lonely sometimes, but I think that people who have never met a ship coming into port that has been gone for 6 months have missed one of the most exciting times of your life. I mean, that was special. That helped. And looking back, I don't remember, at the time I know I was really lonely and frustrated sometimes. I remember I had 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, and the 2 boys went to a local movie one day, and walking home, there were some words spoken somewhere, and they got in a scuffle, and and the older one came to the younger one's defense, and one of them had kind of a bruised face, and so all I could do was comfort them. But Bo said later on, if he'd been home, he would have taken them out in the garage and showed them how to defend themselves. So that's the kind of thing, you know, you missed. Just happened. I was on one dependence cruise, and they do have more of those now, I think, where they take their families to sea. But in the American Navy, we don't do that. But other navies, they do. But I remember Spanish friends telling us about, you know, when they moved, going with the husband in the ship, but we don't do that. Well, in LST in Japan, he had command of minesweeper, an LST, and a destroyer. And the LST was home ported in Japan. That was early on when ships were home ported. Oh, the LST was the Whitfield County. That ship was a new experience for a naval officer who spends his career at sea trying not to run aground. But with that ship, you had to learn to drive it up on the beach. And so that was always a little hard for my husband. Now they do it, it's a very common process. But he was already out there. He was XO in a destroyer in the Western Pacific, and I was where was I? Long Beach. And the phone rang, and it was a detailer from the Navy Department, from Bupers, saying, Mrs. Dietrich, said, are you sitting down? And I said, no, but I will. I scared me for a minute. And I said, no, I'll sit down. And he said, well, I want to tell you I've just put orders for your husband from the ship he is in to take command of an LST. It's home ported in the Western Pacific, home ported in Japan. So, and that was unusual for a detailer to call in a dependent, a wife. They didn't normally do that. They may do it now, but they certainly didn't then, usually. But that was nice of him. So I had to figure out how to get us out there, get passports and all the children safely to Japan. And we did. And we'd been there 2 days, and my husband went off with his ship again. He took command. It was an emergency situation. The commanding officer had Canto Plains asthma, which was a scary kind of thing from the bad air there, and it wasn't uncommon. And they had lost a Navy wife, so if anybody developed that, they were sent home. So he took over that ship. Oh, well, at the first, we had 2 tours there, and the first tour was, I mean, it was all fun and wonderful, but not always easy. And the quarters were not wonderful. They were jerry-built by the Army right after World War II. And, but we had lots of help. Because you know, one day I sat in my living room on this funny old furniture. You couldn't take your own furniture. You took small things, but and I looked around and said, oh, I have a maid who's in the kitchen cooking, and I have a young man outside washing the windows, and there was a woman upstairs sewing for me. And Bo was just a lieutenant commander then, I guess, and we didn't get much pay. You know, Navy pay was pretty skinny pickings then. So wow, this is a lap of luxury. And it was sort of fun. And you know, we were right in with a lot of nice Navy neighbors. So it was fun. We were very lucky. We got to go when it was when he was when he had command of Yokosuka. We knew somebody, the Mark Fruden, I think. He was the commander, the senior Navy person in Korea. And we went to visit them, and they sent us in their car to the DMZ. That was totally fascinating. And with all this recent stuff, I've been looking at even more carefully. Unfortunately, my son, who was with us, the youngest one, was a year short. You had to be 11, and he was just 10, so he couldn't go. But they sent us in their car up. And we went in, you know, we have when President Trump was there, it looked different then. It was a little fancier now, and we walked around the table in the on the DMZ. It was in a little building on the DMZ on the exact line. And when you walked around the table before you came back, you were in North Korea. I've always treasured that, being able to. It was a little scary in a way, but it was awesome because there were Korean troops on this side of the building and American on this side of the building, and they'd apparently had an incident, a little scuffle, and so the Koreans were huge. You know, Korean people were not huge, but these Koreans were pretty big, and so they had made sure they assigned pretty big Americans on our side, so they'd always be ready. But it was fascinating. And the driver was the admiral's driver that sent us in his car. Reached out and touched the little flags in the middle of the table, and he said, "Oh no, boy, that almost started a contrast." It's an amazing thing. You know, you go through these things that are supposed to be villages, and they have recorded sounds of children playing and dogs barking, and they aren't there. It's really very weird. And it was fascinating, just fascinating. Yeah, well, but I've forgotten about that. That was a high point of that time in Japan. The one he liked the best. Yeah. Oh, I think because he had commanded D'Amato. I think about 20 months. That was during the Vietnam War, early in the Vietnam War in the 60s. Yes. And I think he felt kind of lucky not to be ashore. But they were fired upon, and he had brought home some shrapnel that came from his in-port cabin, where he was not, which was good. And he had some things whistle over his head on the bridge, but they were never in any real danger. I think he thought it was a little unsettling to be firing at a shore and people, and he didn't know who they were, what they were doing, whether they were actually the enemy or they were, you know, innocent children and families. But that was their job. That's what they did. The real difference probably is, though, that in the Navy, when you had command of a ship or a base, I remember my husband saying this, you asked for what you needed, and you weren't involved in the total cost of everything. Whereas when you go to work in the civilian world after your Navy days, you have to be concerned about bids and what things are going to cost and so on. It's a different perspective. But yeah, no, I think a lot of management skills, I do believe. Oh yeah, people skills. Eventually he had a job with a company called Traco. It's a Beltway Bandit, or, you know, I know you've heard that in Highway, Highway Patriot. He worked for Tracor for a short time, and then he went to work for BDM, and he loved it. Eventually they were moved down to his group, down to the CIA, and his specialty became China, of all things. And he just loved it and studied it, and finally he got some kind of a stock thing back. He couldn't buy more stock with it, and so he said, well, here's this money, let's go to China. So we did. It was a Naval Academy tour, actually, and it was wonderful. And he could not wait to get to the Terracotta Warriors. He read nothing but history, actually. But he read about them. He wanted to see that. I couldn't hardly get him out of the place. Well, I have one son who was not at least bit interested in the Naval Academy, and went off to college, and when he got to be a senior, a recruiter came to campus. And he was a Marine recruiter, actually. And King came home at Christmas and said, you know, I think I'm going to look into this OCS. And his father, I'm so proud of him, he didn't say, oh boy, good. He said, well, that's interesting, King. And so King did go to OCS. And he said, I'm just going to be in the Navy while I decide what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And he was very bright, but he hadn't figured out much of that stuff. He was too busy having fun. And so he was there a little while, and he retired after 29 years as a captain. he loved going to sea in ships again too. He had command of 3 cruisers, and one was an odd circumstance where a cruiser came out and they changed the whole company of the ship in Japan. That's maybe the only time it ever happened. And the crew of the cruiser that had come out there went back with the other cruiser. And King had also command of the base at Yokosuka, which is our largest overseas naval base in the world. So he enjoyed his naval career. They both had command of the same shore base. Bo had command of Yokosuka, and King had 30 years later, 25 years later. And so when Bo had command of Yokosuka, it was the end of the Vietnam War, and all the people were being evacuated, and the lucky ones brought to the United States, I guess. So he wasn't, they were bringing some of the wounded and some people that needed help to the hospital, the naval hospital, and that sort of thing. But it was, so he was involved in it to that extent. Yeah. Well, in each time that he took command, it was exciting, and I was lucky enough to be there each time, except for the base in Yokosuka. He had to go early, and I had to get the children out of school, so I missed that one. But it's pretty exciting, and it makes you very proud when they go. I mean, because the Navy is wonderful with ceremony, as you well know. They make a big deal out of a change of command, and it was really exciting both for my husband and my son. So